Good evening, and welcome to this 2-hour Dead by Daylight compilation video to relax or to fall asleep to. This video will cover a range of different discussions from the Dead by Daylight community, from fumbled events to underwhelming licenses to insane crossover lore. Now, sit back, relax, and for those of you going off to bed, sweet dreams. Over the past weeks, there's been intense debates about whether non-horror licenses have a place in Dead by Daylight, with Star Wars and Darth Vader being at the center of this discussion. Given that this topic has already been covered by many other excellent channels, such as Pixelbush, I'd instead rather pivot by offering an example of a non-horror sci-fi license that would fit the game much better than Star Wars. This franchise is, of course, none other than the long-running British television programme Doctor Who. In this video, I'm going to go over the reasons for and against its inclusions, and why between it and Star Wars, the big blue box beats it out. Right off the bat, we have to understand one thing. What is horror? And what is horror adjacent, and what is neither? I use the term horror adjacent here to signify a franchise or media product that is not directly within the horror genre, but still overall exudes feelings of dread and tonally fits within the horror genre, even if that's not the main focus or emotional intent behind the product in question. We already have several examples of licenses that people would consider horror adjacent at best in Dead by Daylight, such as Dungeons & Dragons, Lara Croft, Nicolas Cage, and many more, all of whom have their own arguments for and against being in the game. We also have a great many people who say that things like Tokyo Ghoul, because it's a manga/anime, is also not horror, which is both incorrect and ignorant, as the medium with which one tells a story does not make or break it being part of a genre or not. An incredibly good example of something properly horror adjacent would be the works of David Lynch, master director of films such as Mulholland Drive, Lost Highway, Eraserhead, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, Inland Empire, and so many others. None of these films are situated directly within the horror genre. They don't generally contain characters that fit within the archetypes of your usual horror films. Think your Jasons and your Freddys. However, each of these films, to varying degrees, are designed in such a way that watching them leaves you with a feeling of intense dread that only horror can achieve. They are not horror films, but contain several elements from within the horror genre, and therefore they tonally fit in with the overall genre. In fact, this style of filmmaking was so unique to David, and was so impactful, that people ended up coining the term Lynchian to describe things that were not necessarily horrific in the more classic sense we are often used to, but left the viewers with feelings of intense unsettledness regardless. Something being Lynchian is simply another way of saying that something is horror adjacent, in a very specific way. His films are often cited as being incredibly difficult to understand, with very few people being able to grasp any concrete meaning behind most films on a first viewing. His films are most accurately described as being dreamlike, with their own internal logic that is seemingly unknown to us, yet works regardless. What Lynch is most well known for is his collaboration on the series Twin Peaks, which ran originally back in the early 90s, and revolved around the mysterious murder of a young woman in a small town full of strange residents. The show itself is more akin to a detective police procedural than anything else, as out-of-town FBI agent Dale Cooper attempts to uncover the secrets of the small town and the Secret Life of Laura Palmer. The show contains many horrific moments and elements, but is not a horror show in the same way that something like, for example, American Horror Story or Bates Motel are very much horror shows. Furthermore, Lynch's influence was so great within the horror sphere that even if his works were not directly within that genre, they did inspire thousands of horror franchises that came after, many of which are already in the game. Alan Wake, for example, wears its Twin Peaks inspirations on its chest, oftentimes to the criticisms of many a YouTuber. Many of its locations and character tropes being lifted almost directly from the series itself. Another example, the team behind the original Silent Hills have time and time again cited Lynch's films as being their greatest source of inspiration for creating the uniquely disturbing distortion of Little America. Silent Hill 2 is regarded as one of the greatest horror games of all time, and rightfully so. And yet, if you go and watch Lost Highway, a film that released about 10 years prior, you'll see immediately that the film takes the majority of its inspiration from here, to the point where it feels as if you're watching a version of Silent Hill 2, the movie. Now, with all of this out of the way, and a better understanding of horror as a whole, we can look at the two topics of conversation at hand. A quick summary for those not in the know: Doctor Who is one of the UK's largest pop culture gifts to the world, and follows the adventures through time and space of an alien known only as the Doctor, and the people from Earth that he takes with him on these travels through the universe. Now, on paper, if I was completely unfamiliar with the franchise and heard this description, I'd tell you to take a hike. And very understandably so. The premise itself doesn't scream horror, and I'd like to state right now that Doctor Who is not a horror franchise. There is an insufferable trend in media overall, but especially recently within the Dead by Daylight community, to be unable to admit or even understand what your favorite franchise is and what it isn't. In the same sense that a great many fans of both franchises can't admit that they're ultimately made mostly for children, Star Wars and Doctor Who are both franchises that are not within the horror genre and are, to differing extents, not horror adjacent. However, having said that, there is a wide gap between the two of them. The key difference between Star Wars and Doctor Who, when it comes to their inclusion in Dead by Daylight, is the following. Star Wars can have a character like Vader included as a killer, or can have a movie or book that's inspired by horror and not have it feel out of place. The universe within which Star Wars takes place allows enough freedom and expansiveness that you can do so without it feeling out of character. And there are indeed many examples of more horrific moments from the franchise. A good example would be Anakin's fate in Revenge of the Sith. He is mutilated and burned to a crisp, and his half-melted body is stuffed inside a cyborg life support machine. Or the fact that it's heavily implied he murders a bunch of younglings. But the problem here is that these things are the exception, not the rule. Having horror elements from time to time does not a horror franchise make, and Star Wars as a whole is not and has never been created with the intention of unsettling or disturbing you. At best, it is made with the intention of being thrilling or with exciting the audience with tantalizing fights between heroes and villains. But, as a whole, it is not trying to be legitimately scary or unnerving for the audience. Doctor Who, on the other hand, very much attempts to instill fear in the audience as an overall rule. That is not to say that Doctor Who is horror, or even really horror adjacent to an extent. Nor am I saying that this is the main emotion or theme of the show. But being scary and creating tension for the audience is part of the show's DNA. Not every episode of Doctor Who is directly horror themed, but any episode can be, and often is. The show is cited as a family show, meaning that anyone of any age can watch it and enjoy it well enough, while also limiting things like extreme gore or swearing or sex. However, the main audience for Doctor Who, to its benefit, is children. The term "hide behind the sofa scary" is very often credited as coming directly as a result of Doctor Who from early on in its lifespan, due to children finding the programme so scary that they would often want to hide behind the sofa while watching it, as if to distance themselves from the monsters on screen. Most likely the best known example of an episode of Doctor Who from the modern era being scary is Blink, the episode that introduced the world to the creatures known as the Weeping Angels. These creatures turn to stone as soon as you look at them, which, at first, may seem like a laughably easy solution to being chased by something with sinister intent. But then you turn away. Then you need to blink. And suddenly, your life is over. The Weeping Angels are Lovecraftian beings that kill you kindly, with one touch sending you back in time, upon which they feed off your unused potential energy, the days that you now would never get to live in the present. You get to live out your life in the past, and in the current day, you are dead or near death. These creatures are just one example of literally hundreds of different concepts and ideas, all of which stem from the horror genre. Not every episode is as horror-centered as this one. Most hunker down more into a general sci-fi adventure genre. But a vast majority of the episodes rely on being structured in the same way as a short horror film. The most common example of this type of story is known as a Base Under Siege episode, in which the Doctor and their companion find themselves trapped somewhere with a cast of side characters, being hunted or targeted by a murderous entity or alien. These normally play out akin to slashers, with side characters being picked off in gruesome ways, one at a time, until only one or two remain as the sole survivors. The main reason why Doctor Who could work is because, unlike many franchises, the Doctor's power lies directly in his ability to outsmart the villains, using traps and science and knowledge to slow them down, never killing them while there's still another way out, and always trying to make sure that as many people as possible can get out alive. The show is notorious for its lead actors having an exhausting time of things, because there is a tremendous amount of running involved in every single episode. So, the actual gameplay of Survivor in Dead by Daylight fits that perfectly. All of that becomes irrelevant, however, when you reach one simple problem: the hooks. This is one of the very significant reasons as to why the show wouldn't work in Dead by Daylight. While the show does often deal in gruesome or horrific deaths, they are mostly done without the use of blood. A character can be thrown into the vacuum of space, exterminated by ray guns, cut up into pieces and stuffed inside a metal cyborg suit, be entirely consumed by living shadows, but all of these things occur without bloodshed. Even for deaths that do involve bloodshed, like getting mauled by a werewolf or eaten by a krillitane. These deaths occur in such a way that the actual gore is not shown on screen. For this reason alone, the show will very likely never come to the game. Period. No matter how horror it is or isn't, tonally, were you to place the Doctor or one of his companions on a meat hook, or have them drenched in blood for their prestige outfit, it would not fit in with the franchise as a whole. You would be actively changing what Doctor Who is as a piece of media. Furthermore, as a general rule, you can't kill the Doctor, as if you mortally wound them, then they have the capacity to regenerate into a new body. Now, this is only considering if you were to make it either a full chapter or a solo survivor chapter. The Doctor as a character, or any of his companions, work so well and so poorly at the same time that it's incredibly frustrating. If you were to consider a killer-only chapter, however, then you might just be able to get away with it. As I've just said, the monsters from Doctor Who are often quick to give humans quite gruesome deaths, and there are a great many creatures that would not feel tonally out of place within the game. The most iconic monster of the show, the Dalek, has the opposite problem as the Doctor. There would be, tonally, nothing out of place with a Dalek shooting and murdering people. However, given the fact that it is essentially a tank, it would be very difficult to have it function within the actual gameplay of Dead by Daylight itself. How would a Dalek pick someone up? How would it go through vaults or windows? How would it break pallets? There are tons of logistical issues that are caused by it having such a unique design. These problems are not insurmountable. You can come up with solutions if you want. Behaviour have proven time and time again that they can come up with solutions to difficult to adapt characters like Sadako and Chucky. But, unlike with those franchises, if Behaviour were to ever add Doctor Who, they would have a plenitude of monsters to choose from. Of course, it would have to be a selection from one of the more iconic killers from the programme, and one that still felt tonally right for the game. And I think that the much easier character to adapt would indeed be the Cyberman. The Cyberman is one of the most classic villains that the show has, having also debuted back in the 60s with the Daleks during the early original run of the show. These mechanical horrors are based around the very fundamental idea of how far is too far with technology. How much would humanity remove from ourselves in the pursuit of survival? The Cybermen have many forms and many origins, but their base concept is that they wish to forcefully upgrade humanity into becoming like them, removing their emotions and souls in the process. The degrees of body horror vary between the different versions. Some Cybermen are merely the brain placed into a metal suit of armour, while others are entire bodies that have had technology welded onto them. Either one of these versions would work, and the Cyberman would be right at home in the entity's realm, forever pursuing the survivors in order to upgrade them, and delete those who resist. While the Cybermen are generally uniform, if you wanted to choose a specific Cyberman character, I believe the best bet would be to go with the lone Cyberman, Ashad, from Series 12. Not only is he visually the most horrific of the lot, his suit being old and rusted and cracked, his deformed face partially visible from within the suit, but he is one of the few Cybermen who has their own personality and individualized backstory. You could, of course, then make his cosmetics be the various different types of Cybermen that there have been from throughout the ages. Furthermore, the the Cyberman has a unique tie-in to something that does tonally fit the world of Dead by Daylight. The well-known and well-beloved Doctor Who spin-off show, Torchwood. Torchwood came out during the great mid-2000s revival of Doctor Who, and was meant to be an adult-catering version of the show. The show focuses on a team of underground, grungy alien specialists who are tasked with helping keep Wales safe from outer-worldly threats. When I say the show was adult, I mean it was adult, to the point of heavy criticism from many during its first series. The show is the polar opposite of Doctor Who, featuring spays of swearing, and sex, and violence, and gore, and blood. To give an example, the second ever episode of the show features around a sentient space gas that arrives on Earth and kills people by shagging them until it can feed off of their orgasmic energy. It's that sort of a show. The reason that this works so well with the Cyberman killer is that the show features a cyber woman as one of the aliens. A human woman who was only half converted into becoming a Cyberman. So, thematically, having a Cyberman within a Torchwood chapter would not be out of place. From within the show, you also have a wide variety of characters to choose from for a survivor. The only major problem is that the main face of the show, John Barrowman, who plays Captain Jack Harkness, has been blacklisted from the franchise, following resurfaced allegations of inappropriate behaviour in front of cast and crew on the set of the show. This, by default, removes the character that would be the most obvious choice for a survivor. In that sense, it is a shame, as the character of Captain Jack is immortal and cannot be killed no matter what, and therefore would be a very interesting lore addition to put in a realm where everyone else is, more or less, unable to die. The next obvious choice would be Gwen Cooper, police officer turned Torchwood agent, who serves, in the show, as our narrative entry point into the dark world of the spin-off show. Her empathetic nature and competent police skills would make her a brilliant asset to any survivor team in the fog. And perhaps her lesser experienced personality makes her an even better choice than Jack in that regard, given that a lot of people tend to complain about survivors in Dead by Daylight often being a little too OP in their respective media, in the sense that it makes not a lot of sense as to why killers like the Legion, who are just teenagers, can get the jumps on characters like Jill, Leon, or Ash from Evil Dead. The only other real issue with this idea is that Torchwood as a television franchise has been dormant since 2011. The fourth and final series, Miracle Day, ending on a cliffhanger that has since only been addressed via the medium of audio dramas. It is not an active franchise that the BBC is trying to push into people's minds, especially not now with the allegations against John Barrowman. So it puts it into an awkward spot and brings us back to Star Wars. Why bother pushing something more tonally correct like Torchwood, when you could push something like Doctor Who or Star Wars and get 10 times as much money? But for me, personally, it boils down to one simple fact. As a lifelong superfan of Doctor Who, there are still dozens of horror franchises that deserve to be in the game well before it. That's just the simple fact of the matter. The same with Star Wars. If we had infinite new chapters every week, and we could get everything under the sun into the game, then sure, why not? But we simply don't. We receive approximately 4 chapters a year, give or take half chapters and solo survivor or killer chapters, and generally speaking, only half of those are licensed. The game is almost 10 years old now, and while it's still full of life and momentum for the minute, it inevitably won't last forever. There will come a day when we get our last chapter and last new license for the game, and that will have been it. By the nature of the live service game, there are inevitably dozens of horror franchises that simply won't have a chance to ever come to the game. And with every horror-adjacent chapter we get, it pushes out more deserving franchises. I'm not here to debate whether things like Dungeons & Dragons or Lara Croft or Rainbow Six Siege are or are not horror, or whether they deserve to be in the game or not. Because I do think it's equally foolish to not allow for experimentation, especially when the result ends in something that players enjoy, or that improves the game overall. Lara Croft is arguably the least horror-related main survivor we have in the game. And she's also the most popular licensed survivor in the game. Her inclusion fits well enough tonally that I think the amount of people that enjoy playing her is more than worth her being an inclusion in the game. Even if there were 100 other survivors I'd have chosen before her. I would not be upset if, or when Star Wars, or Darth Vader, or Doctor Who came to the game. And I'm sure Behaviour would find a way to make those licenses feel wonderful, and incredibly fun and immersive. But I would inevitably lament the smaller horror franchises, like Ginger Snaps, or Leprechaun, or Orphan, that have a lower and lower chance of ever coming to the game. You can play as Darth Vader in 100 different forms already. That experience already exists. If you want to play as him, you can quite literally turn off this video and go do that. For most horror characters, Dead by Daylight is their one and only chance to get another day in the sun. There are no other games around that could give you the true experience of what it's like to play as characters like Pinhead, or Sadako, or Pyramid Head. Dead by Daylight should be a place where, equally, while adding horror icons you already know, they should be adding more obscure characters as to nudge the players along, and maybe help them discover their next favourite film, or book, or TV show. Whatever the future holds for the game, whether it be Vader, or the Cybermen, or anything else, I just hope that not too much integrity is lost along the way. It's no secret that Dead by Daylight has been neglecting its lore for some time now. Ever since the Rift Pass rework, it's been a downhill plummet into the abyss. But this is not an isolated case, but rather a symptom of a larger problem going on behind the scenes at Behaviour. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the new tome, The Frayed Rope, and how it represents everything wrong with Dead by Daylight. In early 2025, Dead by Daylight announced that they would be retiring the Rift Challenge system, and would be revamping it with a new, streamlined quest system. We went from the unique and challenging, if albeit somewhat obtuse, interconnected Tome and Rift challenge system to having an automated, somewhat soulless quest system that does everything automatically without needing to consciously engage with it. What's worse, we went from getting multiple new lore stories every 2 to 3 months to now being drip-fed each story week to week. Tome 23, the first new tome after they decided to overhaul the tome system, came out in late September of 2025. We are only just now, in April/May of 2026, receiving Tome 24. That's an over 7-month time span to receive precisely 3 stories. The way that the system previously worked was that any given tome would release with a certain amount of unlockable entries to 3 different stories, which you could unlock as fast or as slow as you liked. This was only gatekept by 4 separate rift levels, which would each unlock every few weeks as the rift progressed. Now, all players are automatically unlocking a single new entry in a single story every Tuesday. As if this wasn't bad enough, something that should have been a great innovation for the rifts and the lore as a whole, the addition of illustrations, has become a burden. Because these images take up slots that would have previously been purely for more story, we are in reality only receiving a single part of the story every 2 weeks, as every other week is reserved for the associated image. This also means that every tome story is significantly cut down compared to what they used to be, with only 5 written word entries as opposed to 10. Even the biggest of lore diehards can't be bothered mentally to keep up with this bizarre and frustrating release pattern. Why read a section of a story when you have to wait another 2 weeks just to read the next paragraph? After a long half-a-year period of receiving no new lore due to the separation and rework of the Tome and Rift systems, we finally received our first entry in the new Tome 23. It arrived with absolutely zero fanfare and as much excitement as licking stamps, and most players would have been forgiven for not even noticing that the tomes were back in the first place. They had been relegated to a tiny button in between the midst of the options and friend list buttons. The only indication that anything had changed being a tiny red exclamation point. The few people that did notice this were most likely disappointed to see who the first story of the new tome focused on. Evan Macmillan, better known as the Trapper, one of the least exciting characters in the game to possibly receive more tome lore. This was coming off the back of having received 2 new Rift passes heavily featuring lesser loved characters, such as Haddie and Elodie. It felt like a slap in the face to the fans of those characters to finally, after years of waiting, get their characters featured in the new Rifts, only for them to not receive any new tome lore at all, as they would have previously done under the old system. Furthermore, Evan already had a tome story, one that retroactively changed a lot of his backstory from what he had been in the base game, making him more of a sympathetic, tragic figure, rather than the hulking evil that many saw him as. The story itself, as it was revealed over the weeks, wasn't by any means bad either. It gave players a unique look into the metaphysical process of how a killer is taken from their world into the entities, and finally gave us a definitive answer to the origin of the hooks in his back and the bear-like mask he wears. But the problem remains that virtually no one, not even the lore enthusiasts, read any of this. It was just dumped and hidden away and never mentioned. The second story was much more interesting in terms of expanding the universe, as it gave us a look into the life and final days of Renjiro Yamaoka, a character who has been long mentioned in the lores of both the Spirit and the Oni, and has been rumoured to be coming as a solo survivor chapter for the longest of times now. This story explores how the Yamaoka family bloodline was stolen by him, and it adds a twist of irony to how hellbent Kazan Yamaoka, Renjiro's son, is on the idea of purity within the samurai. However, the quality of the story ultimately has little importance when it has all the same problems as Evan's new lore. It goes mostly unread by most players. It focused on a character that no one is particularly interested in, and takes up a slot that could and should have gone to one of the many characters who still have yet to receive a tome story. And it is plagued by having half the entries be illustrations, no matter how nice they are. It would be one thing if Renjiro had indeed arrived as the March solo survivor, as many had speculated before it was revealed to be the all-kill comeback chapter, because at least then it would have tied in with the character release and given a new face some extra sauce to get people excited in him. But, as it stands, until he is released, it is nothing more than several months that were dedicated to a flavor text character. Despite knowing that people are already tired of the Yamaoka storyline, due to them already being the focal points of 2 separate chapters, I still believe that lore like this has its place, and new expansions to existing storylines in the universe will always make me happy. And Renjiro's story is no exception. And with the old tome system, it would have worked just fine, if you have his story be half of the world-building section of the lore, with Hadi or Elodie or whoever you like taking the main stage to expand their stories. The third story, however, is by far the most inexcusable. It is yet another of several entries into a fictional DBD version of the Brothers Grimm. And without wanting to sound like a broken record, you just cannot afford to be dedicating several months' worth of lore to these characters who are unrelated to anything going on within the game itself. I appreciate that they build on a handful of things, namely, the idea that artists within the Dead by Daylight universe are visionaries, and that their stories are inspired by the real-life happenings of other universes. But with the tome system like this, you simply cannot afford to be doing these meandering, ultimately pointless stories. Another disappointing aspect of this new tome is that it continues the trend of getting tome stories without cinematics. We used to get all sorts of short visual stories, some of which featured incredible animation, like with the Clown's vintage-style short. However, nowadays, we don't even get those. Why bother investing money in animating short cinematics when no one is going to watch them? Now, all of this could be forgiven. Maybe Tome 23 was just a filler tome while the devs worked on how best to implement the new tome system following it. Maybe it would be nothing more than an unfortunate footnote before a return to form for the lore. Then, Tome 24's first entry was released. It may feel a tad melodramatic to say this, but I wholeheartedly feel like the newest tome encapsulates everything that's wrong with Dead by Daylight as a whole. I want to go over the story itself, what works about it, and why it represents everything that it represents. Tome 24, The Frayed Rope, opens with a brand new story that serves as the missing link between Sable, Michaela, and Julian. In theory, this is a fantastic idea, using the tome lore to try and fill in on the blanks on why Sable is never mentioned in Michaela's lore, despite Sable claiming to be her best friend. Furthermore, it gives us a look at Julian, a character who, until now, had remained without a canon visual appearance. We get to see that he's an alternative emo-styled boy, which fits in perfectly with the trio, and opens the door for what will hopefully be an extremely popular survivor somewhere down the line when he inevitably releases. The story takes place from Julian's perspective, while the three of them are teenagers, and gives a real depth to the three of them despite the shortness of the story. It shows precisely where Sable enters the picture, and how Julian dislikes her immensely for butting in on the story, where it had previously just been him and Michaela. It's a very charming, simple story that gives a good semi-fourth wall commentary on the Greenville gang. The reason I think this represents what's wrong with Dead by Daylight is that it's a perfect encapsulation of how much potential the game and the story has to be truly great, and how every single time they seem to fumble the ball. The problem with this tome is not the story itself, which I think is filled with charm and character, but the fact that it didn't come out 2 years ago, when Sable originally released. Why did it take this long to get such a simple, obvious story? This sort of connective tissue between the two chapters needed to be present from the moment the chapter released, and would have immediately quelled complaints that Sable is a self-insert character. There were, quite literally, theories that the entity itself manifested Sable from nothing in order to feed off her imagined emotions, and that Michaela had never known Sable in her real life. That's how poorly put together the lore is. Like everything in Dead by Daylight, it takes far too long to get something that should have been there from the start. It's the same story every time. There was a period of time between the releases of The Knight, The Skull Merchant, and The Singularity where behavior made it a rule that every new rift that released after an original chapter would be themed around the chapter in question. At the time, this got a lot of backlash because it meant that characters who had already been released but didn't yet have tome lore would have to wait for a rift that coincided with a licensed chapter to get a Russian roulette chance at being picked to get their lore, assuming that the license in question didn't end up receiving its own lore, which also started happening with semi-frequency with things like the Saw or Castlevania tomes. Furthermore, some people argued that because they had tomes coming up immediately following their releases, behavior would skimp on the actual base lore itself. I remember watching at the time a Pixelbush video on the subject, and it's not an argument without merit. Getting tome lore isn't really worth much if it's just lore that should have been included with the base chapter itself. It doesn't help that characters like the Knight and the Skull Merchant were extremely problematic and unpopular due to their 3-gen style of gameplay at launch, and so people would feel it was even more frustrating having to see them everywhere they looked. However, I would still argue that this method of release is the closest we have ever gotten to a genuinely great tome system. I would give my left arm to have gotten a rift themed around V and the Kurasu in the autumn of 2025 when that chapter released, or a Tori and Houndmaster rift around the winter of 2024. This brings up another point of frustration for people, which is that not only are these lesser loved characters not getting any new lore or focus, they don't even get the benefit of receiving things like rift outfits or recolors. The Houndmaster released over a year and a half ago and has received precisely one single permanent new store outfit since then. Having a rift themed around her wouldn't eliminate the problem, but it would have very much eased the pains the character felt during her very rocky launch period. Having said that, last year during the tome rework, Deathdorks revealed that they were at the time indeed working on a tome that featured the Houndmaster, but this has yet to show itself, unfortunately. Which just brings me back to my main point. It's good that the Houndmaster will at some point receive something in the rift. It's good that Sable and Michaela's lore is finally being even slightly fleshed out to make it more believable. But why does it need to take literal years for these things to happen? Why are these things not planned out in advance so they can coincide? A good comparison and example for what I mean by this is the implementation of the badge and banner cosmetic system. An incredibly cool and exciting new feature that allows players to express themselves further and customize their profiles more. Great. Obviously, it released with a dozen default badges and banners to start players off, and launched in tandem with a badge section of the store where you could purchase a bunch of new badges for 50 Oryxels each. Of course, I'm being sarcastic, as in reality, The system launched with a whopping 0 free or default cosmetics. And from the release of the new system, which was at the same time as the launch of the Chucky chapter, the only badge or banner you could get in the entire game were the ones you received for purchasing the Chucky chapter. We wouldn't receive any new ones until the Bone Chill event of that year, over a month later, which were limited time and locked to the event rewards. After that, it then became an incredibly slow drip feed to players via new rifts and events. It turned something that should have been incredibly fun and exciting into a frustrating demonstration of incompetence. We regularly get dozens of meaningless player badges nowadays, most infamously for things like Jim Beam, the bugged beam that would appear during the match load-in during the Walking Dead update. It's clearly not that badges are hard to make. It's simply that, for whatever godforsaken reason, they simply didn't consider that it would be a bad idea to launch a new cosmetic system with essentially 0 cosmetics for months on end. This goes further into insanity when you consider their refusal to give survivors or killers with multiple characters, such as Aestri/Baymar, the Twins, or the Legion, a prestige badge that represents all of those characters rather than the arbitrary default character they've decided is the only one who deserves a prestige badge. It's absolutely baffling because they've repeatedly demonstrated that creating new badges is not the issue. It's purely being stubborn. It's not the first time that they've committed a mistake like this, as when they updated all of the killer profiles, they forgot to add the rest of the Legion members and just added Frank. And after a lot of community backlash, they then added the other 3 members in the background. However, in this case, it isn't that they made a mistake and are now going to rectify it, but rather they've made a choice and refuse to go back on it. People often blame the game's buggy code for many of the issues behind the lack of quality in the game, and this is often very true. But there is an equal amount of blame to be placed on the absolutely bizarre choice-making that goes on behind the scenes when it comes to things that shouldn't be an issue in the first place. First and foremost, the old tome system was far from perfect. While the overall style and soul of it was wonderful, it quickly became apparent that if a new player was interested in learning more about the lore of their favourite character, then the tome system was near impossible to navigate. If you joined the game and wanted to see some Trapper lore, for example, how on earth are you supposed to know within the confines of the game that he has 2 lore entries, one in Tome 1 and the other in Tome 23? The only way to know is to dig through every single tome and check every single story. Furthermore, there are several tome stories that are completely inaccessible via the game because they were tied to event tomes, such as Michaela's stories from the Witch's Cafe. The tome system did need a revamp, but so far the game has done what it does best, and instead of trying to fix anything, has simply left it out to die a slow death. What I would suggest would be to do something akin to the Prestige track update. Add a section to the Bio tab that compiles extra tome lore all under the character in question, and leave the tomes to be purely for world building. If a player wants to learn more about any given character, they should be able to do so as easily as possible, as it's already hard enough to convince a player to read a story instead of playing the game while they have it open during their limited free time. Another change would be, and this is being lenient to behaviour, to release each written lore entry with an illustration attached, rather than being separate entries that take up 2 different weeks. In a perfect world, we'd be getting an entire tome story every week, given the vast amount of characters within the game. and the fact that writing these stories is fundamentally the cheapest part of the game, with the only real development costs being towards the handful of illustrations and the vocal reading of the stories. You don't need a massive, insane rework of the system. Just make it easier to access individual character lore and increase the output of stories overall. It should not take the better part of a year to receive about 10 pages worth of lore. Despite the negative tone of the video, I do not believe that the team behind Dead by Daylight are greedy or just out for money, nor do I think that they're incompetent. In fact, it might be easier for me if they were, because it would at least be an explanation for why so many inexplicably poor decisions are made. If they were just after players' money, they'd have launched a banner and badge store with 50 different cosmetics, all priced at $4 each, and players would have most likely bought them. Instead, badges and banners are given out mostly via free events or codes, or included at no extra charge with certain cosmetics, which is a player-friendly thing to do, and something I admire them for. I don't know quite what the problem is, but ever since the perceived failure of the casting of Frank Stone and the cancellation of Project T, whoever is in charge of where priorities lie has clearly decided that the lore is by far the most expendable part of the game. And, to an extent, that is indeed the case, but only because they allow it to be. For many players, most new original characters live or die by their lore. Take a character like Tori, for example. Despite her intense lack of cosmetics or acknowledgement post-launch, she is still a cult favourite. Haha. For a lot of players because of how entwined in the lore she is. If she was just a girl with a buzz cut and an enjoyment of robes, people wouldn't be nearly as interested in her as they are currently, because of what an interesting story she has. I know that I'm in the minority for this, but even a cosmetics flavor text can make or break whether I buy it. It's for this reason that the Unknown, who also receives a pitifully low amount of new cosmetics, always has my favourite flavor text in the game. Each outfit coming with its own new urban legend sighting of the Unknown is always my favourite thing to read, on the rare occasions that it happens. It would be a dream come true if the Unknown could one day get a creepypasta or urban legend themed rift. Although if I recall correctly, they've said before they have no intentions of giving characters like Dredge or Unknown tomes at all. I only feel disappointed because I know that the game and the team behind the game are capable of doing truly great things with it, and it makes me feel sad when the game only ever reaches mediocre heights. It's the same way that for every positive a new update or patch has, it'll bring with it 3 times as many problems. I hope that one day the positives can outweigh the negatives, and that going forward from the 10th anniversary of the game, it can bring back the love it once had for the world that it's built. Since the reveal of the All Kill chapter, people have been whining about how X or Y has ruined Dead by Daylight forever, and how certain things aren't horror and don't belong in the game. This only intensified with additions like Dungeons & Dragons and Lara Croft, licenses that are horror adjacent at best. However, the discussion reached its ultimate critical mass with the reveal that the spring 2025 chapter would be none other than the widely acclaimed Tokyo Ghoul manga/anime. People were outraged at the idea of an anime coming to Dead by Daylight in the form of a chapter, because anime is not horror. Of course, this argument is both ignorant and incorrect, as an art form's medium does not define what genre it fits into, and there is no reason at all that Tokyo Ghoul should not be classified as a horror for being an anime, in the same way that it would make no sense to classify Friday the 13th as not being a horror for being a film. However, Tokyo Ghoul was not the first, nor was it the last, anime property to collaborate with the game. In this video, I'd like to go over every anime that's collabed with the game, and why I think Dead by Daylight has a severe anime problem. Before we begin, a staggering 99% of you watching aren't subscribed. Whether you enjoy these discussion videos or my Dead by Daylight to Sleep series, if you want to stay up to date with what comes next, please feel free to subscribe. Now, on to the complaining. Dead by Daylight has come very far from its humble origins as a tiny game on a wonky engine, created by a handful of people as a passion project. And, as the game has grown, so has its need to expand the potential for what the game can include. Starting out with your classic slasher icons from film history, such as Myers and Freddy and Leatherface, it quickly became apparent that the game would quickly run out of licenses it could acquire if it were to stick purely to slasher films. Behavior branched out into the medium of television, with licenses such as Stranger Things and Ash vs. Evil Dead, but these are still live action, and ultimately about as easy to adapt as films. We even began to get game collaborations, which is, in retrospect, the sort of thing you'd think would have happened much sooner, all things considered, with licenses such as Silent Hill and Resident Evil and Five Nights at Freddy's being added, all to extreme success. It wouldn't be until the summer of 2022 that we would get our first entry into the world of Japanese animation, with the Attack on Titan cosmetic collection, which added almost a dozen different cosmetics, all inspired by the series. As I've already done a video on the subject, I'll keep this section more brief. You can go watch that if you want a more detailed look at why Attack on Titan ultimately fails. But after the hype died down from the insanely cool trailers and lobby theme / menu, it became apparent that the collab was not half as strong as it appeared from the outside. It came with 2 Titan skins. However, skins would indeed be the correct term for them, as despite the fact that they were advertised as legendary skins, they were merely the original killer characters in every way, shape and form, except for a model swap. Their sound effects and voices were the same, their powers were not altered in the slightest, and most importantly, they were not larger than any of your other killers. Of course, that's just a slight joke criticism. Obviously, you wouldn't realistically expect your killer to be 27 feet taller after purchasing a skin, but it's an undeniable fact that playing as a Titan that's the same size as a human fundamentally misses the point of the experience you should be trying to achieve in making these skins. Furthermore, there were absolutely no legendary survivors included whatsoever, with all the human characters being relegated to cosplay outfits. While not the worst thing in the world, it again misses the point, and ultimately makes sure that my wallet stays nice and full, instead of forcing me to fork out my cash. Because while I would spend $15 on an Eren Yeager legendary skin, there is no way on earth that I'd fork out even $10 for Dwight Fairfield in a potato sack. It's a nice idea, but falls flat because of how awkward the outfits look on a majority of the characters, with a few exceptions like Hanji or Kenny. But, all things considered, this was Dead by Daylight's first ever attempt to add anime characters into their game. And they already have a hard time creating convincing looking character models in their own style half the time. I can't half blame them for wanting to take the safer route with their first attempt, and stick to only creating new Titan models, given that they're easier to translate to the DBD style, due to being monstrous creatures. We would see no further anime collaborations for a handful of years after this, until 2025, when we would receive 3 new additions, Tokyo Ghoul being one of them, in a form of a chapter, and the other 2 as collab collections. The first of the cosmetic collections was a dream come true for manga horror fans, with the works of Junji Ito being added to the game. Junji Ito is one of the most renowned horror creators on Earth. his name and style being synonymous with horror in manga. And so it seemed like a no-brainer that his characters would be added to the game. To sweeten the deal, this would not be limited to one single story, but would cover the entirety of his works, both popular and lesser known. The crown jewels of the collection, of course, were the Tome Legendary for the Spirit and the Misfuchi Legendary for the Artist. These two skins were not skimped out on either, unlike the Titans, and featured entirely new animations and voice work, and, outside of a few small things here and there, are just really wonderful additions. 10 out of 10, no notes, bugs aside. All of the outfits, in fact, are more or less pretty good, even if they seem to steadily decline in effort after the two main legendaries. Looking at you, Dredge Legendary skin with no new voice work or sound effects and one single boring and slow new animation. But, overall, nothing to complain about, right? Except one reoccurring theme that has now crossed over from Attack on Titan. If you are a Survivor player and wanted your favourite human character represented, then tough luck. Hope you like Kate doing a cosplay, because that is all you're going to get. But I suppose maybe it's just the nature of the cosmetic collaboration then. Surely whenever the inevitable anime chapter happened, we'd finally get our first proper anime survival. The Tokyo Ghoul chapter released 2 months after the Junji Ito collection, and featured neither a new map nor a new survivor, instead featuring only a killer and only cosplay outfits for random original characters. I think you're starting to see the pattern here. While Kaneki is one of the best adapted licensed characters in the game, and has been one of the top players permanently since his launch, if you're a Survivor player, then you're just shit out of luck again. Unless you want to play as David King, wearing a crappy cosplay mask that in no way, shape or form suits him. It's becoming more than apparent that the lack of anime survivors is not because of the nature of cosmetic collections or because of licensing issues, but simply because behavior does not have the courage to make a fully fleshed out anime survivor, legendary or otherwise. This fact was only further compounded when later in 2025, we received the 4th anime collaboration, Night of the Living Cat, which again features a killer visceral legendary skin and a cosplay outfit for Yui. It's bad enough for Yui fans, who are seemingly eternally doomed to only ever receive cosplay outfits for her, given how she's the de facto choice for Japanese character cosplays. But it sucks for fans of any of these animes. If you wanted to play as Eren or Armin or Mikasa from Attack on Titan, well, tough luck. If you wanted to see Ghoul Investigator Amon taken into the fog and given a rematch against Kaneki, then sorry pal. Or Kaneki's human best friend for that matter, Hide. Hope you enjoy an add-on and a crummy cosplay, because that's all the reference that they're ever going to get. If given a choice between having a license added as a killer only or survivor only, you're generally always going to pick killer, as it inevitably involves more effort being needed to create a fitting power for whichever character you're adding, as opposed to survivors who are ultimately just skins, save for perks. However, this doesn't excuse the fact that this gives them even less of a reason for excluding survivors entirely. With the inclusion of any new survivor, the amount of work required is significantly less, and falls mostly on hiring voice talent to create new vocals and having their animators rig up a new model. Survivors all share the same basic and rudimentary animations for most tasks. The only animations required come mainly from facial features, most of which are consistently bugged and poorly made regardless. It would be one thing if it had been a simple side effect of the growing pains of experimenting with new types of media in the game, and they'd then later on proven that they could manage to translate an anime survivor into the game without them looking uncanny. as they managed with Kaneki and Rize. But for whatever reason they have, it's become more than obvious that no matter how much money it makes them, that for the foreseeable future at least, they are never going to give us a fully fleshed out human character for Survivor players. It goes hand in hand with the already existing problem with the game, in that a majority of licenses nowadays don't come with licensed survivors, leaving them as an afterthought or excluded entirely, save for exceptions like The Walking Dead. Half of the Horror Hall of Fame icons are missing their respective final girls. Majorly popular franchises of recent years like Five Nights at Freddy's or Tokyo Ghoul have come and gone with nothing other than a cosplay and maybe a t-shirt for Survivor players. It's understandable that in a lot of cases it will always be the monster that brings in the big bucks. And you can technically do these chapters with just the killers, but I think it really devalues the stories that these characters come from. There are plenty of killers who would fit a solo killer chapter much easier. Characters without concrete stories, like Slenderman or any of your other creepypasta type killers. Tokyo Ghoul is known for its wonderfully cruel and emotional story, and to not have a single one of the human characters represented is just a baffling choice. This tendency makes me really fear for the future of anime collabs, of which there will be plenty, I'm sure. In my personal opinion, the next most likely candidate for a full chapter would be Death Note, given how popular and requested it is. And I fear that when it inevitably arrives, it's going to follow the same trend and only include Light and Ryuk as the Shinigami killer. I'm sure that this will make them buckets of cash regardless, especially with the obvious Misa and Rem visceral legendary that they could do for it. But it would break my heart to have the human characters left out yet again. If I have to see Dwight wearing a white shirt and blue jeans and paid $10 for it under the guise that it's an L outfit, I think I'd actually lose my mind. It's not even that I don't think that all the cosplay outfits are terrible. Some of them are quite nice. But generally speaking, I think behavior and the player both lose out whenever they opt for doing these things instead of fully fleshed out legendaries or characters. Even with licenses like Castlevania, which is about as close to a legendary anime survivor as we've gotten, Alucard sold like hotcakes to the point of being much more popular than Trevor Belmont himself, while the rest of the cast that was relegated to cosplay outfits are never seen, never purchased. When was the last time that you saw a Trevor using one of the Belmont cosplay outfits? Since the launch of the chapter almost 2 years ago, I believe I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I've seen both outfits in a match combined. Behavior wants to make money, people want to buy their favourite characters. It really is just that simple. There is, of course, the possibility that all 4 of these licenses just so happen to have strict license holders who didn't want a survivor character, or that adding a survivor would have cost Behavior further money that they weren't willing to fork up. For obvious reasons, the collaborative business deals behind Behavior and other companies are all different and have their terms hidden from public view. Most people have a tendency to be misguided about how these things work. But the reality is also that people very often place the blame on the mythical license holders, when in reality Behavior has plenty of say in a great many matters as well. It's no coincidence, for example, that survivor characters very often have their outfits linked for seemingly no reason, except for when they are solo survivor chapters. All solo survivor chapters are mix and match, whereas if they had come to the game in a full chapter, there would be a great chance that this would be changed for no other reason other than to force you to cough up €10 instead of being able to just buy the individual pieces. These are made unlinked in solo survivor chapters to give you extra incentive to actually purchase and play as the character, as if they were all linked, then a lot of people who would otherwise play wouldn't bother purchasing the character at all. as opposed to if they just received it with the purchase of a larger chapter. There are often mentions of license holders requesting that outfits be linked to maintain brand identity. However, this has been repeatedly disproven time and time again with various different licenses. This is further disproven by the fact that for half of DBD's lifespan, linked outfits didn't actually exist at all. But no, it must just be a giant coincidence that every license they got up until 2020 had no issues with cosmetics being mixed and matched, despite many of these licenses being notoriously stingy and hard to work with. The linked cosmetic system only came with the introduction of the Silent Hill chapter and the Legendary system introduction, and came not from necessity, but from behavior wanting to see how much money they could make from linking cosmetics. I can guarantee you Konami didn't say, Cheryl can't mix and match anything except for half a dozen different shirts. I've mentioned all of this, not only because I believe people have a misconception about how licensing works, and what they request to be restricted, but also because, up until recently, all anime cosmetics have been locked within the linked cosmetic system. That was, up until they ported over several of the Attack on Titan mobile cosmetics, many of which only included 2/3 of an outfit, namely just the torso and the trousers. As Behavior for some reason haven't figured out how to make only 2/3 linked sets yet, they are unlinked and mix and matchable with any and all other cosmetics available on those characters. It shows that in a lot of the anime cosplay cases, the cosmetics are not linked because they're legally obligated to be, but because they want you to buy the whole thing and only use it like that. Having said all of this, it's not to say that it's never the license holder's intention for them to be linked for thematic reasons. With the Five Nights at Freddy's collaboration, for example, I can absolutely imagine that Scott wanted to keep Springtrap's cosmetics linked, although that in of itself is also unconfirmed. My point here is that defaulting to saying, well, they can't do anything, license holders, is very often an overused statement that absolves Behavior from actually having to put in proper effort with a lot of things. And if there's anything that you should take from this video, it's to consider using that statement more sparingly. I'm praying above all hope that the next anime chapter or collaboration breaks this trend, and that Behavior shows that they're more than capable of bringing all these wonderful potential characters to life, and not just making shoddy imitations that please no one and make them zero cash in return. Now that we've reached the end of the Attack on Titan themed 2v8, it's safe to say that this has been by far the most disappointing edition of the game mode since its original launch. In this video, I'm going to be going over exactly why this specific 2v8 has left such a sour taste in people's mouths, and why it is by far the worst 2v8 overall. Just before we begin, a whopping 98% of you watching aren't subscribed, so if you enjoy these videos, please be sure to consider it. Now, on to the complaining. Attack on Titan originally came to the game in the summer of 2022, and was met with a mixed response. The overall sentiment was extreme excitement. However, the fact that there were no legendary survivors coming, only cosplays for the original survivors, dampened this excitement somewhat. In fact, survivors that would have been received incredibly well as legendaries were turned into laughingstocks due to their unfaithful and awkward visual looks, such as Dwight as Eren, or Felix as Armin. The most popular and successful skin by far was the Armored Titan, a legendary skin for the Oni, which was by far the crown jewel of the collection. But even then, there were still complaints, given that the Oni's overall visual power was not changed, and he still wielded a kanabo, as opposed to something more in-fitting with the character. Of course, the Warhammer Titan for the Spirit was received with even less enthusiasm, if for no other reason than the fact that she did not, in fact, have a Warhammer, which you'd assume would be the most obvious thing you need to include for the character. Furthermore, she was essentially a glorified reskin for the Spirit, despite being priced as a full legendary, when, in reality, outside of the visual appearance, neither the legendary nor the power was remotely like the character in the anime. It's for these reasons that the original edition of the license was already met with mixed results. I know that personally, as a fan, the only skin I ever ended up purchasing was the Annie skin, and that's only because she has her hood up, which makes it easier to pretend that it's the character rather than Meg in a cosplay. Despite the skin selling well overall, fate would have it that the license would be only in the game for precisely 1 whole year before it would become one of the few licenses to be removed from the game store altogether. The skins were packaged together in 2 bundles and put on a mega discount sale, and, in the summer of 2023, were removed from the game entirely. It wouldn't be until the autumn of 2025 that the collaboration would return to the game, all its skins being re-added to the store. As with the return of the Stranger Things collaboration after its removal, and its subsequent return, no new content was added immediately. It was merely that everything that had been previously available was once again ready for purchase. It is only now, in May of 2026, that we received what we can call Attack on Titan Wave 2 as part of the Bloodbound update, with a bounty of new skins and a dedicated themed version of the popular 2v8 game mode. On paper, this should have been a fan's dream. However, the way it played out was anything but. Our first look at the new additions to the collaboration showed us that we would be receiving several ports of previously mobile exclusive cosmetics, which had only been available on the now defunct Dead by Daylight mobile. This was something that people have been asking for ages now, and is exciting enough to finally have all the costumes together in one place. But mobile ports are one thing. What were we receiving that was new? The answer to this question would be a single new cosplay outfit of Sasha for Talita. A nice enough cosmetic, yes, but underwhelming, to say the least. And what about the ports of the mobile outfits then? Several of them had been tweaked and polished up, in specific the Mikasa Special Operation outfit for Yui and Levi's cleaning outfit for Jake, which brings the original lower quality mobile outfits up to date with the polish needed and deserved for a fully paid outfit in 2026. The only new Titan being added, however, was also a port of the Attack Titan. Or, rather, 3 ports of the Attack Titan. In Dead by Daylight Mobile, as the game was a gacha, they had a tendency to have several variants of the same outfit, and in the past we've received these outfits ported from mobile to the main game, typically only with one of the variations, such as with Sadako or Yoichi's mobile exclusive outfits. This time, however, all 3 variations of the Titan were ported over at once, the regular, crystallized, and ember versions, all costing the same price as a fully fledged legendary skin. So, if you wanted all 3 versions of the skin, you would have to fork out $45 for them. There was a bundle with all 3 that lets you get them for only just under $25. However, most people weren't even aware that this was an option and just paid the full $45. It's a beyond shameful and incompetent business practice that every other game out there has already solved. In Fortnite, for example, if you purchase or own a single piece of any given bundle, the bundle itself will be significantly reduced in price. This would be an obvious solution here, aka if you own any of the Attack Titan variations, the other two are significantly discounted. But nope. And to call this a legendary skin is an embarrassment to the term, as not only is it missing several key features that are the bare minimum for characters in the category, but it is also missing features that had already been created and implemented, such as his unique match intro animation. When they returned to the store, the Armored Titan and the Warhammer Titan were demoted in class and price to the Ascended rarity, because they lacked most of the features that legendary characters have, and therefore didn't deserve to be priced as such. They could have taken the opportunity to rectify this with the Attack Titan and make him a legendary worth buying. He's already at a disadvantage being placed on a character like Trapper, someone that most people don't play ever, and whose power is as far removed from the Titans as you can possibly get. However, the skin has no unique voice or sound effects, no unique Mori, and fundamentally serves as a glorified Trapper skin outside of having a handful of new menu animations. This is coming right off the heels of receiving the Mina Visceral Legendary character for the Comeback chapter, the most bang for your buck legendary skin in the game currently, due to how much love and care went into making her, and how many features the skin comes with, including her own unique lobby music, new voice lines, new Mori, among many other things. When you use the Attack Titan skin, absolutely nothing about it feels like Attack on Titan. As a huge fan of the series, I feel zero desire whatsoever to purchase it, or any of the other skins for that matter. I don't want to play dress up as Trapper with a different model and the same sounds and power. I don't want to play as Dwight in a potato sack that's supposedly supposed to be Eren. Dead by Daylight's strongest attribute is the ability to get an experience that you cannot get anywhere else. You cannot get the experience of playing as Sadako, or Amanda Young, or Pinhead in any other game. And of course, there is a difference between a full chapter and a cosmetic collection. And of course, naturally, these Titan skins, regardless of power, would only ever feel immersive if you were abnormally large and the survivors were abnormally small. It's a shame that there's never been anything like that in Dead by Daylight, and the closest they could get was doing a 2v8 themed around them. Except there is. The rarest game mode in Dead by Daylight's history. My Little Oni. The April Fool's game mode, My Little Oni, was a joke mode that lasted for only 48 hours between April 1st and April 3rd of 2024. Since then, it has not resurfaced. In this game mode, you were able to play as either a miniature survivor or an oversized Oni, and was unique in that it bypassed the hook system entirely. Instead, survivors were able to be killed immediately upon being downed, by being crushed by the Oni. And in turn, survivors had only a significantly reduced number of generators that they had to complete. The game mode was not polished by any means, and quickly wore out its welcome, but it was the clear basis for something completely different than anything we'd seen before. It was quickly rumoured that this was a testing experiment to see how well a giant killer could work, and whether gameplay around such a thing would be well received, or even possible. There are plenty of killer characters who are large and that could require innovative gameplay such as this to succeed, like Godzilla or King Kong or Cloverfield. And, of course, Attack on Titan. The most obvious connection we have here, outside of it being a perfect fit due to the size difference, is that the Oni is the character upon which the Armored Titan outfit is set to. For that original game mode alone, had cosmetics been allowed on it, it would have been an instant perfect fit. But, like I said, the mode was clearly in an experimental phase and needed a lot of polishing before a second round should have been attempted. People expected it to come back in 2025 for that April Fool's. And April Fool's came and went, and no sign of the mode. The same thing happened this year in 2026. There was no sign or mention of it at all. When it was revealed that the next 2v8 was going to be Attack on Titan themed, people were excited, but also confused. What about the 2v8 was exactly Titan themed? In prior themed 2v8s, the bare minimum was to receive 2 outfits for the characters being added, such as with the Castlevania and Silent Hill or Resident Evil chapters. Of course, Attack on Titan has no direct killer, as it's not part of a chapter. So, surely the next logical step would be to add 2 new Titans. There's not a shortage of characters they could choose from, or Titans whose personalities might fit certain original killers. Instead, all we received was a half-baked, overpriced cash grab of something that had already been created and released several years ago. Furthermore, nothing in the gameplay itself reflects the license at all. For example, for the last edition of Lights Out we've currently had, which was Castlevania themed, we received candelabras, which survivors could hold to light the way and perform a variety of actions with. With the 2v8 Resident Evil, we received the various healing herbs from the games, which were scattered around the trials and provided various benefits when consumed. It would make perfect sense then to have a brand new My Little Oni themed around the 3 Attack on Titan killers available in the game. The Oni, the Spirit, and the Trapper are the only killers that have legendary skins for Titans, and therefore would be the only killers you'd need to adapt to the game mode, significantly reducing the work needed to make it work. The only real problem with it would be that it would be unfair to not allow people to play a new game mode unless they forked out cash for the skins. However, with previous game modes, behaviour has repeatedly made characters free to play for the duration of their themed events. It would not be out of the realm of possibility to allow people to use the skins for the game mode, while still making them purchasable overall regardless. But instead, we received a 2v8 with absolutely nothing to do with the license, that mostly just added tidied up versions of outfits that were already created years ago by a separate company. It's just such an unbelievable waste of potential and everyone's time that it's actually quite impressive how lazy it is. I am a giant fan of Dead by Daylight. I am a giant fan of Attack on Titan. I want to feel compelled to spend my money on anything they're offering, and I absolutely don't. It's genuinely quite a massive accomplishment to have made me so apathetic towards something that normally I'd have forked out at least $100 on. The second biggest problem with the collaboration is something that's a symptom of a larger problem with all animes added to Dead by Daylight. Ever since the astounding smash success of the Tokyo Ghoul chapter, and the various other anime licenses that have also been added, such as Junji Ito and Night of the Living Cat, there's been one constant issue between all of them: a lack of survivors. Throughout every single anime collaboration we've gotten through the years, not one of them has had the courage to attempt a proper survivor, whether that be as a full character or a legendary set. Human characters are always relegated to cosplay outfits, and I can't for the life of me understand why. It's not as if these characters wouldn't make money. I can only assume that it's that behavior doesn't feel comfortable enough in themselves, and their ability to successfully translate a manga or anime character into a one-for-one survivor and not have them look off, just by the nature of how Dead by Daylight's art style needs to remain somewhat consistent and realistic. I would imagine that this is why they're a lot more relaxed when it comes to killer legendaries, as all the anime collabs have featured one or more of these. However, there's simply no universe where I'm ever going to fork out $10 on Dwight Fairfield wearing an awkward looking Eren outfit, because if I want to experience the character, I'd only ever be willing to do so on a legendary outfit. I, and presumably many others, don't want to be dressed vaguely like Eren. I want to be playing as Eren. It's this frustrating thing where I'd be willing to give behavior more cash if they just went the extra mile with it. And instead I get to keep my money nice and safe in my wallet, because they are so half-assed with it. If the collaboration had dropped with a legendary survivor of any character, I would have bought them, because I am a fan of the show, and would be beyond delighted to play as any of them. As it stands, Attack on Titan has over a dozen different outfits, and absolutely none of them make me feel excited or like purchasing them at all. I'd easily take just one or two well-made legendary skins over any amount of cosplays any day. Moving into the actual game mode itself, this version of 2v8 is not only nothing special, featuring only minor changes to the gameplay and an additional map or two, it also removes things that they had previously added, namely the Legion. Legion's power is obviously to chain injuries and snowball in power if they can do so, and so a mode with 8 survivors is an absolute dream for them, being able to get multiple Feral Frenzy hits in just a matter of seconds with relative ease. Combined with characters like Oni, who feeds off injured survivors' blood orbs, it makes it a lethal and often annoying combination to face. Instead of trying to fix Legion, or alter their power so it has a cap or limitation, or even go with their new diminishing returns philosophy that they're attributing to perks so they can't get out of hand, they simply announced that Legion was being removed from the game mode entirely and was unlikely to be added back, calling his addition a mistake. I can't quite express how baffling this is to hear, and I still have trouble believing that this is the situation that we're in. And I think it shows a major problem in the mentality of those making decisions in the game. Even if we ignore the fact that Legion is counterable, given the fact that he can be removed from his power entirely with well-placed pallet stuns, which is enhanced by 2v8 effectively having infinite pallets, considering they can be rebuilt, on top of the fact that he is not even a particularly strong killer in the first place, I agree and understand with the sentiment, we didn't realize how much players would dislike facing him, so we want to give him a timeout until we can properly balance him and find a solution that keeps him fun to play and fun to go against. If something isn't working, you don't have to be arrogant and ignore the problems, and I think it's great that they recognize that Legion needed some changes. What I think is beyond baffling is simply giving up and going, well, that's that then. If the Legion isn't working in 2v8, then it is your job to make him work. It is not a Herculean task that requires thousands of man-hours and the greatest minds of the world to come up with. There are several simple solutions that could be implemented with relative ease that would fix the problem. Make it specifically so when paired with Oni, Legion either has his power capped or produces unique blood orbs that only give a fraction of the blood power to Oni, or limit Oni's power in rage mode. Obviously, these solutions also have their own problems, but even those are not unsolvable as well, and it is their job to fix these things rather than to give up. It's embarrassing, and a further punch to the gut for Legion fans after the Legion already spent the past month disabled in 1v4, and had the devs refuse to give them a badge for any of the members except Frank, despite the fact that the whole gimmick for the killer is that there's actually 4 of them. I don't understand why this game mode came back in the first place, being announced and advertised as a new themed version, when it is arguably an even worse version than the last couple of times it came out, and has absolutely nothing to do with Attack on Titan. Well, I do understand it, because it's purely that 2v8 is popular and gets people playing. Why bother putting in effort or time or work when people are going to play the game and buy the skins regardless? It's just sad, and makes me feel disappointed as both a Dead by Daylight fan and an Attack on Titan fan. The show deserves better, and the game deserves better. The Slasher, or, as they're hesitant to refer to him as in the game, the Big J Voorhees, has finally come to Dead by Daylight after an entire decade of fans clamoring for his inclusion in the Horror Hall of Fame. His inclusion has been a rocky road, to say the least, from an incredibly successful yet controversial teaser campaign to both exaltations and frustrations from fans and casuals alike. From an outsider's perspective, the Friday the 13th license is as perfect of a fit for the game as can be, and yet due to licensing hell, it's been impossible to get the slasher until now. And even then, this is not the Friday the 13th license, but simply the Jason Universe license, as it's called. There's a lot of confusion around what is and what isn't canon with this version of Jason, especially given that he has yet to receive his own film, as so far the only media featuring this version of Jason is A24's upcoming Crystal Lake television show, which will feature none other than Linda Cardellini as Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother. Because this version of Jason is legally required to be somewhat vague, instead of his typical origin story being in his bio, like with most licensed characters, he actually has brand new lore in both his bio and perks that plant him firmly as being from the world of Dead by Daylight. This is not to say that his origin from the films didn't happen, of course. Camp Crystal Lake could be just around the corner from the DVD locations we're going to see him at for all we know. However, if this is the case, it is neither confirmed nor denied in the lore. So that we're all caught up to discuss it, let's go over Jason Voorhees' new, insane Dead by Daylight lore together. Just before we begin, a whopping 98% of you watching aren't subscribed, so if you enjoy these videos, please be sure to consider it. Now, on to the complaining. The slasher looms at the edge of the tree line. On his face is an old, worn hockey mask, expressionless, a grave threat. Ahead is a tent, the silhouette of a camper within. If it were any other misty night, the Greenville forest would be alive with the sounds of wildlife. Tonight, there is silence. He takes stock of anything useful scattered near the tent. Rope, tent spikes, a hacksaw. Gripping his machete with a strength that could crush the handle, he steps from the shadows. A quick swipe tears the tent open. It's not a camper that stares up at him. It is something else, almost human. Skin twisted and deformed in a familiar way. Mouth fixed in a perpetual grin. Covered in blood, holding an axe. There are signs of a struggle, yet no victim to be seen. The creature watches and waits, twitching with uncertainty. The slasher stares back, fixated on its misshapen face.
"Can you help find my hat?"
asks the creature, voice shifting between pitches. Without warning, it plants its axe into the slasher's chest. The slasher doesn't hesitate. He reaches out and snaps the creature's neck, wrenching it backwards. It remains standing. He stabs his machete into its belly. The creature's head twists back into place. Moonlight reveals dark holes where its eyes should be. A fleshy proboscis extends from its neck and opens. A booming force strikes the slasher. He staggers, disorientated. The creature's axe cuts through his muscle, hits bone. The slasher slams his hand forward, through the creature's chest. His fist tightens around what feels like a beating heart. He rips his hand out, holding not a heart, but a clump of entangled flesh. The spidery thing crawls up his arm, stabbing with hooked protrusions. He rips it off, chunks of skin coming with it. The creature seizes the advantage, knocks him down, tosses the axe aside, and wails on him with surprising force. Ribs snap like dry wood. The slasher reaches for the hacksaw. He slashes it across the creature's throat. Pink ooze spills onto his mask. The creature continues its assault. The slasher scrapes the blade deeper, cutting through thick, sinewy flesh until the creature's head falls from its body. It writhes in the dirt, a desperate, violent, and ineffective movement. After a final thrash, it collapses, lying motionless. The slasher turns away, scores of wounds across his body, and strides into the darkness. A crimson trail follows his every step. Behind him, a warbling voice calls out,
"I could use a hand here."
In a flash, the headless creature charges on all fours. Tentacles burst from a gaping maw on its back and seize the slasher. Snapping jaws emerge, burrowing into his body. He spasms. Blood seeps from the holes of his mask. The moon's glow darkens. With one final push, the slasher thrusts his fist through the worming appendages and into the maw. He rises to his feet, lifting the creature, impaling it on its arms. With an overpowering heave, he slams it onto the ground. Still, it moves. The slasher grabs its legs and swings it into a tree. A sickening crunch. He swings again. He doesn't stop until he holds in his hands 2 legs, unconnected to the fleshy puddle of gore that lies beneath him. Something twitches in the puddle, as if thin threads of muscle twine back together. The slasher looks around. The mist that permeates this forest turns black. In the gloom, he glimpses visions of skittish, fearful people roaming the forests. He storms through the dark cloud, wisps parting to reveal a young woman, olive-skinned, scarf around her neck. Her eyes widen in terror. He swings his machete. Her screams are cut short as she chokes on the blood that spews from her throat. Her death echoes through the realm as a warning. Jason is here. In this story, we get to see the brutal confrontation between an unknowable object and an unstoppable slasher. Jason preparing to slaughter some innocent, defenseless campers in the Greenville woods, and instead getting met face to face with the most horrifying of Dead by Daylight's original killers, the unknown. As I'm sure most of you are aware, this skin-stealing mimic killer stalks the urban legends of the world, its origin varying depending on who you ask. Some believe it to be an alien fallen to Earth. Others believe it's an escaped government project. All that we know about the unknown is that it steals the visuals and voices of those it consumes. Jason does not immediately recognize what it is, just knowing that it is not the innocent camper he was expecting. The insane thing about this is that it is heavily implied that this takes place not long after the Unknown's infamous viral teaser, where rare found footage shows the creature attacking a camper inside of their tent. Jason seemingly arrives in the aftermath of this, the body of the camper having already been assimilated by the Unknown, and their epic battle commences. Whilst Jason just manages to win the fight, it is not without a price. He is battered and bruised, and has several intense injuries by the end of the fight. But as the black fog pulls him in, he continues his rampage nonetheless. I like to look at this as being the entity's final test of worth for Jason, pitting him against a creature as fearsome as the Unknown. And managing for him to come out on top proves he truly is built like no other, and deserves to murder endlessly in the realm. The location this takes place at, of course, is Greenville, which is a location that has shown up time and time again over the lore of Dead by Daylight. Not only is it one of the many homes to the Unknown, with many sightings and disappearances directly related to it, happening in and around the town, but it is also the hometown of Sable, Michaela, and Julian. It is here that Michaela disappears on stage in front of dozens, where Sable investigates the vintage cinema and willingly enters the doorway she finds into the entity's realm. This is because Greenville is situated, or perhaps is better described as being the heart, of an overlap or a bleed. These are places where the fabrics between realities are worn down and torn again and again, allowing for dimensions to merge and for people and creatures to travel between the real world and the entity's world. These overlaps are something of a self-perpetuating machine, as they are provoked by repeated emotionally intense events happening in locations, such as murders or tragedies. And as these events become more and more frequent, so does the deterioration of the locale, and thus the number of horrors spotted around these spots grow more and more frequent as well. We see in Sable's lore that she initially believes it to be because of the Unknown that Michaela disappeared, and this is because many disappearances throughout Greenville were caused by innocents being devoured and replaced by this beast, as we see in its teasers and cosmetic lore. It's no surprise, then, that Jason would inevitably find himself face to face with the creature sooner or later, after enough stalking of the deep dark woods. And, in turn, it makes perfect sense that it would be his triumph in such a dimensionally sensitive area that would be the triggering point for the entity to finally decide to take him. As I mentioned earlier, Jason's lore makes no reference to any of the films nor the Voorhees name, and a lot of people have taken it to mean that this Jason is from Greenville. However, I don't believe this to be the case at all. We see that Jason roams to other lands in the Dead by Daylight world, such as Mount Ormond, and so I'd imagine that all the events of the films did indeed take place, in their own legally distinct way. Whether Camp Crystal Lake is anywhere near Greenville in this universe is another debate entirely, but Jason clearly has a long history of killing already, and he's clearly already experienced by the time of his taking into the entity's realm. His various add-ons and perks all indicate that Jason has been a blight on this world for some time now. Not quite man, not quite myth. Some awful thing in between. In my personal opinion, while a certain amount of the vagueness of his lore is down to certain license issues, I'd imagine from what I understand of the situation that this new extension of the license is in that they simply don't want to make any concrete references to anything in specific, given that this version of Jason has yet to show up in any non-collab related media. This Jason is the inevitable end goal of the A24 Crystal Lake show, but it's a simple fact that the show doesn't exist for the public to view yet, nor do they know whether it will be a success or not. It makes sense from an overall viewpoint to neither tie it to the older films nor the newer stuff they're going to be putting out, as to not isolate older fans or put off fans if the new show is a failure. It's sort of like how most people these days seem to forget that A Nightmare on Elm Street is in the game, purely because it doesn't feel like it's in the game. I am obviously a massive fan of both The Nightmare and Quentin, but it's undeniable that they are from the least popular representation of the franchise by a mile, and their reputation in-game suffers for it. Speaking of Freddy, this new lore is a very clear homage to Jason's propensity to fight other icons of horror, namely when we remember the film Freddy vs. Jason. Here, he gets to duke it out with the unknown, Dead by Daylight's own newer poster child, and win. One of the most fun things about Jason's addition to the Fog is that it gives new life to the old film ideas for other collabs involving him, many of which were turned into comics, such as Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. Once the update comes to life, you will be able to indeed hunt down Ash from the Evil Dead as Jason, and fulfill what we should have gotten to see on the big screen decades ago. I think the saddest thing about Jason's new inclusion is the lack of any mention at all of his mother, Pamela. His inclusion in the game marks the first time since the release of the Xenomorph in late 2023 that a killer, licensed or otherwise, has been brought to the game and not had any voice lines added, either in lobby or in trial. Jason is a silent killer, so this isn't half unexpected. However, there was a great assumption that to overcome this voiceless barrier, they would include Pamela Voorhees inside of his mind, egging him onwards with her classic, "They deserve to die, Jason. Make them suffer" lines. Not only is her voice nowhere to be seen, but she herself is not mentioned a single time, be it in the bio, or the perks, or the add-ons. Opening up the add-ons and seeing anything other than Pamela's decaying head as his iridescent add-on was a real blow. It's one of those things where it stops being about whether she's canon or not to him, and being simply that her exclusion is just a thematic failure. Spoiler alert for several decades ago, but in the original film it's Pamela who's the actual killer, and it's only in later films that Jason becomes the big beefcake we all know and fear. Excluding her is like adding Texas Chainsaw Massacre Bubba, but without his chainsaw. Sure, it's still him, but what he's missing makes him more than just a guy in a mask. Jason's motivation and anger and rage all stem from that same rage that drove his mother to serial murders in her anguish and mourning. It's also just a damn shame in general to not get Linda Cardellini doing voice lines. If it meant that Pamela could have been included, I'd easily have accepted the chapter being the year 11 or even 12 anniversary license. This version of Jason has already shown up in other collaborations, namely Fortnite. But in those games she can be excluded, as he is indeed more of a skin than anything else. Here in Dead by Daylight, it should be the definitive article when it comes to playing as Jason. There should be no higher quality of experiencing the character, the actual Friday the 13th game notwithstanding, for a variety of obvious reasons. And without his mother, Jason is missing what makes the character more than just another slasher. It's entirely possible that they get the chance to rectify this in the future, maybe even doing a pseudo second chapter with the actual Crystal Lake television show after that has debuted later this year. But realistically, it's just stuff that should be coming at launch. Speaking of Crystal Lake, it goes without saying that not having a map at all is beyond a shame. The game has never had a truly Jason-esque lake camp map, which is astounding because of what a classic horror location it is, even for franchises outside the Friday the 13th films, like Sleepaway Camp. It has always been assumed that they never would have added one preemptively under the cautious assumption that it would then make an inevitable Camp Crystal Lake map feel less exciting if they ever managed to get the Jason license. Now that they've managed it, there is no map in sight. It would be acceptable if it wasn't even Crystal Lake, but an original, generally themed camp map. But no such luck. It's no secret that maps make behavior the least amount of money for the most amount of effort, by far, compared to releasing survivors or killers or skins. So it's not entirely unpredictable, given that only a few months ago we got the massively detailed Neon Korean Trickster map. But it feels disappointing all the same. As of the 10.0 PTB, we are currently aware that the chapter will launch with a new original survivor, whose perks have been added to the general pool for testing, but the survivor in question remains a mystery. At first, it looked as if we might be getting a secret new survivor from the Friday the 13th franchise after all. Maybe Tommy Jarvis even. However, these rumors were quickly shut down by behavior themselves. The survivor is an original character, unique to the universe of Dead by Daylight, and it's unclear whether they are hiding them from players because they will be an exciting lore addition, or a new fan favorite, or if it's simply because they haven't finished creating the survivor in a shippable form yet. I mention this because if the survivor is coming with Jason, it could mean that on June 14th, when the chapter releases, we might get a second dose of Jason lore. It's currently being theorized that given Jason is stalking Greenville in his lore, that the new survivor might be the third, yet to be added member of the Greenville gang, Julian. He, along with Sable and Michaela, currently have an ongoing Tome story that will finalize around a week or two after the chapter's release. People have been asking for an emo or alternative boy survivor for years now, and with the insane popularity of Michaela and Sable, it would make perfect sense to release a highly marketable and interesting new original survivor, along with the fan favorite killer. It would be a super interesting way to celebrate 10 years in the fog, having a half original, half licensed chapter. And even though it's disappointing we don't get any proper Friday the 13th survivors, it might still be a salvageable situation. The one proper sore spot I have from this fact is that it continues a trend that I find incredibly irritating within the game, which is that for a supposed horror hall of fame, it lacks almost every popular final boy or girl in the genre. Michael Myers launched with Laurie, which was a good start. Freddy came with Quentin, which was an interesting choice, to say the least. However, after that, it all sort of goes downhill. Texas Chainsaw Bubba didn't come with Sally. Ghostface isn't even from Scream, and thus doesn't come with Sydney. Hellraiser neglected to arrive with Kirsty. Chucky has no Andy or Nika, and so on and so forth. Jason being a solo killer once again contributes to the trend of neglecting half of the reason people enjoy horror. Obviously, it will always be the killers that rake in the big bucks. But many of these human characters have wild and passionate fan bases. And it's really sad to see their franchises come to the fog and never get the chance to see characters that by all rights should be coming to the game too. Ironically enough, the license that everyone began guessing once they started the mysterious livestream teaser, Slenderman, would be a perfect candidate for a solo killer chapter. Yes, there are human characters of interest in both Slenderman and the Marble Hornets universe. However, none are truly as intrinsically tied to the character, or as overall popular, if we're being sincere. It is much easier for Slenderman to exist as his own chapter and not feel like he's missing something compared to Jason, or any of the other previously mentioned killers for that matter. There is, of course, the fact that oftentimes the lack of survivors or killers within chapters come from behavior needing to free up character slots in order to allow more licenses in, such as how Five Nights at Freddy's came with no survivor, but in turn we were allowed to get our first ever duo survivor chapter with The Walking Dead. It will soften the blow somewhat if in a few weeks it's revealed we get another insane license, such as the X-Files, which is what I'm personally placing my hopium on. But nonetheless, it is difficult trying to decipher what's making necessary sacrifices and what's just cutting corners. For the minute, there may or may not be more reveals to come. Maybe some secret new realm is sitting in the files waiting to be revealed on June the 14th. Maybe the lack of content and updates over the past months have all been leading up to a giant revamp of the entirety of Dead by Daylight that they'll only reveal on the June the 14th. However, it's looking unlikely. The Jason license has been a mixed bag of both good and bad, and both sides have valid points towards their grievances or enjoyments of his arrival in the fog. Only the full release can show us if the Big J can stand the test of time, or whether the hype will fail to hide the shaky foundations the license is arriving on.